Baby. Hi. I don't know what I'm doing. Hi, I'm so glad you're here. I have somehow acquired 4 clocks. Not 1, not 2, 4.
The number of the day is 4.
And none of them are on my walls. And that's because none of them really fit the vibe of my living space. I do thrift flips all the time, like when I made this corset out of ties. You can watch that video here. So instead of keeping them piled up on a shelf, I thought I would flip them and whimsify them a little bit more so that they can be displayed and used. If they work. I don't know if they're all functioning clocks, so I do need to go test them, but I also need a plan, because right now I got nothing, but we're gonna figure it out. So let's go see what we can do. When I first saw this wall clock, I thought about making it a Halloween decoration, like a monster with an open mouth and the pendulum would be like the tongue, but I like the clock too much as it is to completely change it, so I'm just gonna add some moss and flowers to make it look like it's been left in a magical forest for a long time. For the big one, I'm not sure why, but I immediately thought of the moon face from Méliès's film A Trip to the Moon, so I think that's what we're going for with this one. To mark where the numbers are, we'll add some little stars with faces in the center, which is another reference to the film. I tossed a lot of ideas around for this kitchen clock, but in the end, I wanted to do a Gravity Falls themed clock, with the Bill Cipher Prophecy Cipher in the middle and the Mystery Shack built around it. This little anniversary clock was actually the first one I had an idea for, and that's because of the spinny bit. I immediately pictured fairies dancing in a circle with vines on the columns, overgrowth and flowers, and a ring of mushrooms, also known as a fairy circle, around the outside. Now that we have some direction, let's test out the clocks and see if they actually work. The big one was a bit deceptive because the hands move very gently, but the ticking of the gears was proof enough to give it a pass. The little kitchen clock had been in storage for a long time, which was obvious when I saw the battery mess on the back. The wall clock with the pendulum was next, and it worked like a charm with just a new battery. Last but not least, the anniversary clock. It's missing some decorative bits on the top and has a lot of damage from a battery that must have leaked all over it at some point, so it needed a good cleaning. Armed with a Q-tip and some vinegar, I got to scrubbing, taking it apart as I went along. The backing was really hard to remove for some reason, and I did break off one of the plastic clasp things, but unfortunately it wouldn't be the last thing I break on this clock. After a thorough cleaning, I tested the clock with a new battery, and it worked! I snapped the remaining decoration off, filed the edges down, and then cleaned the kitchen clock too before calling it a night. The next day I tied back my inconveniently dramatic sleeves and got to work sculpting for the fairy clock. Until I realized I should probably make the moon first because I wanted to use air dry clay for it and that would need time to dry, so I shifted gears. I don't have sandpaper, so I used a metal nail file to roughen the surface, which will hopefully help the clay stick to the clock better. I was a little nervous to sculpt the face because symmetry and recreation aren't really my forte, but it was looking pretty good, so I set it aside to dry. Now it was time to make the fairy clock pieces, since they'd have to bake for a while, so I started with the fairies, sculpting directly onto the crystals, and then just popping the pieces off after to be baked with everything else. I also grabbed this translucent polymer clay to make their flower petal dresses, and I've never used translucent clay before, but I thought it'd look cool if it turns out sort of glass-like. I sculpted many petals, then got to work on the vines. I wasn't sure how these metal columns would fare in the oven. I didn't know if they'd melt, so I made some aluminum foil columns to hold the vine shapes while they bake. I made all of the flowers and leaves separately to be added on later, gave the fairies leafy bodices for their dresses, and then sent everything away to bake for about an hour. Once they were set, it was time to put everything together. I probably should have used a more permanent glue, but I just hot glued everything. The flower petals weren't exactly glassy like I imagined, but I still liked the slightly translucent quality they had, and I enjoyed putting their little dresses together. Gluing the vines onto the columns was a little tricky because my foil versions were slightly larger than the actual columns, but as long as the leaves on the ends are attached, they should stay put. I glued on a ton of little flowers and leaves. Then put the dancing fairies to the test. Only to find out that I made their dresses too wide and none of them could actually clear the columns when they turned around. The only fix to this was taking them completely apart, trimming the flower petals with some scissors, and starting over on the fairies. Then I also realized I forgot to sculpt their hair, but I decided to leave that challenge for the next day. I decided I didn't want to sculpt the hair and wait for it to bake, so I decided to use embroidery thread and hot glue. It was a little tricky because they're so teeny tiny, but it worked. Then it was time to paint. I painted some tiny details onto the fairies' dresses, added their faces, and then added some purple flowers to the clock face. Then I remembered the fairies still needed wings. I bought a sheet of sparkly white paper from the craft store to make these, and I love the little shimmer it adds. I then added the overgrowth and the tiniest little mushrooms for our fairy circle, then all I had to do was put the backing back on. And this is when things went wrong. It was just as tricky to put on as it was to take off, and in the process, the metal wire that the fairies hang from snapped in such a way that I could not repair it back to its functional state. I could hang them from a string, but then the actual mechanism that makes them turn as the clock turns wouldn't work. The spinny bit, the reason that I chose this design in the first place, would not spin in the end. Frustrated, I decided to take a break from the Fae and finish up our man in the moon, only to find that he had cracked all over the place. After I gave myself a pep talk, convincing myself that it's fine, it's the moon, it's crackly, it's rough, it works, I started painting on the details and sealed it with Mod Podge. Next, I took some gold paper and foam sheets I also got from the craft store and started making the rocket to put into his eye. I hot glued this together using foam strips to make the metal panel details and added a layer of brown acrylic paint to make it look more like aged metal. I made our little star ladies with some scrap paper and gold paper, and I didn't want to clutter up our handsome moon man with too many of them, so I only put one at 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock. The next issue I ran into was the clock hands not clearing the rocket as they turned, so I took my jewelry pliers and bent them up and out just enough for them to successfully pass by the moon's facial features. I also added a moon and star to the clock hands based on 2 other shapes from the film, just for fun. By the end of the day, I still had 2 more clocks to make, and ironically, I had run out of time. So I decided to work on them the next day, when I started on the Gravity Falls clock. Before doing anything else, I took it apart and painted the base layer onto the clock face first so it could dry. This one required a lot of fake wood to imitate the Mystery Shack, so once again I brought out our foam sheet and started making wooden panels. To make the wood grain, I raked my tweezers across the surface of the foam, pressing down harder on the edges to sort of cut through the sides and roughen them up a bit. I swiped some brown acrylic paint over each piece, and then I started constructing our clock. I used cardboard from my stash to make the peak of the roof, foam board for the wall, and cardstock for the window. Then I glued on every single individual wood panel, and I gotta say, if I hadn't had the show running in the background, this repetitive task would have gotten old very quickly. But before I knew it, the whole clock was covered. I thought making the little letters for the sign was tricky, but when the time came to paint the details into the cipher, I ate my words because it all had to be done with my tiniest brush, and it was quite meticulous. But when it was done, it looked so cool, and I almost showed you, but I remembered to save it for the reveal. Although we still have our little overgrown clock to make, so I got to covering it with moss and flowers, inside and out, to make it look like the moss has grown inside of the clock. And added a thin sheen of gold paint to the surface to add a tiny bit of shimmer. And that makes 4 out of 4 clocks complete. So it's time for the reveal. You hear that? That's the ticking of several clocks. Maybe I've made a mistake. Uh-oh, uh-oh. Are you coming up? What do you have on your nose? Yes, hello, my love. Thank you for joining me. Are you gonna lie down? No! Oh my god. That's where my arm goes. That's okay. I'll put my arm over here. What are we doing? What are you doing? Can you lie down? To be honest, I didn't really know what to expect when I planned this make because I only had a vision for 2 of the clocks at first. It took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do because I just couldn't settle on an idea for the last 2 clocks. And I was afraid because I didn't have a solid concept in mind that I wouldn't like whatever I did with them in the end. But I couldn't have been more wrong because I love all 4 of the clocks. They each have their own feel. I think these 2 are the ones that have the most similar vibe, which is why they're in my little fairy Ghibli cottage living room. I really didn't expect to like my Gravity Falls clock as much as I do, but I really love how it turned out. Are you back again? No, my love. You simply must lie down. And it was so much fun having the show on in the background while I was working on it because it just consistently inspired me as I was working on it. The only thing is, it doesn't work. It's the only clock of the 4 that I couldn't fix or couldn't clean thoroughly enough to make it work again. It had a pretty bad battery leak problem, which I really wasn't expecting because I think of the 4, it's the most recently made. It's the newest, but it was to the point where the little metal piece that the battery connects to when it's in broke off. So it doesn't work. But it is a very fun decorative piece and I love it very much. I have a little candle in the top part that can make the window glow. But as I always say, if you can make something glow in the dark, make it glow in the dark. So now I have 4 clocks on display when before I had none. That's another successful thrift flip on the books. I really like what I made, and if you do too, you can let me know by hitting the like button. And if you want to see what I'm doing next and join the channel, hit the subscribe button. And if you want to know when I post, hit the notification bell. YouTube will let you know. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!